numbers I'm seeing are 2, mostly 2, 4, and 5. So we'll do those 3. For number 2, slope. This is something that we talked about at the beginning of this unit. Label them if you need to. We are going to be using our y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. You don't need to write this. I'm just rewriting it for you all. So we're going to do 3 minus negative 2 over 2 minus a negative 3 to get a positive 5 over a positive 5 over 2. If you switch these and got negative 5 over negative 5, that was okay. If you got negative 5 over positive 5 or vice versa, that was not okay. That means you switched one thing but not the other. Questions on that one? As always, make sure that these work and answer is written on your answer sheet. Number 4, there's a lot going on. So you may, if you didn't already, want to switch this to the number 5 slot so you have more space, or just make sure you have space. So this is similar to the test question about higher, lowest score, something like that. So the Buffalo Bills scored 24, more than twice the number of points Miami Dolphins scored. Altogether, they scored 66 points. We're trying to figure out how many did each team score. So we need variables. I'm just going to call 1b and 1m for number of points they each scored. Then for the first sentence, Buffalo Bills scored 24, more than twice the number of points Miami Dolphins scored. So if I knew the number of points they scored and I multiplied it by 2 and added it to 24, I would get 80. So 24 plus 2m. Altogether, I know they scored 66 points. So if I added b plus m together, I would get 66. Then I could take my equation for b and put it into this one. So I have 66 equals 24 plus 2m plus the m that was already there. And then combine the terms. And start to solve for m. So that when we divide both sides by 3, m equals what? I'm going to divide that times 2. 14 points. Then you have to put this back in. You can either put this back into the b's equation, or you can put it back into the 66. Either or, doesn't matter. And solve for b. So that b is 52 points. So it's a lot, but you need all of that work for that problem. Do we have any questions on that? For number 5, we have a fraction that equals another fraction. What is our first step? Multiply. So we have 3 times x plus 1 equals 2 times x minus 3. Distribute. and then move something to the other side. So let's say we subtracted 2x and subtracted 3. So we get x equals negative. Questions on that one? So what? So we cross multiplied, distributed, subtracted one term from one side and one from the other. If you haven't already, take out your graphing notes. You need to finish those. If you need another one, let me know so I can get you those. Start those notes in this last bit. Does anyone need another intercept note? So we had talked about how to solve intercepts graphically and algebraically, but not in this format. So we're going to do that. It will be the same process, just it'll look a little bit. So with number 1, we would still be putting 0 in for one of the variables x or y, depending on what we're solving for. So let's say we're trying to solve for x. We're going to put 0 in for y. And then start to solve for x. So that when we get here, we divide, so that x equals 3. But after we do this, we still have to write them as ordered pairs. So that would be the 0.30. Isaiah, do you know what's that? I don't know. I do not recall. For the y, you're going to do the same thing. Here we can start to skip steps. So you still have to put 0 in to show that you know how to start solving this. But we know that this is going to be 0, so we don't have to put the 0. So we can just move on and put everything else and then solve for y like that. So that would be the 0.08. So when it's in standard form, we don't need to convert it. We can just solve it just like normal. So you still have to write them as ordered pairs. The numbers you get may not be the opposites. This happens to work out that way, but they won't always be that way. Questions on that one? Okay, let's try one more, and then we'll go over any others you guys need. So for number 2, same process. If I'm trying to solve for x, I would put 0 in for y. And then solve for x. How would I write this as an ordered pair? But if I wanted to solve for y and put 0 in for x, this is just going to go away and there's no other work to do, which is y equals 8, which you can put as your ordered pair. So if you get something similar to that where you have like just the variable and then the number, it would just be that ordered pair. Look at numbers 3 through 10. See if there are any others you want to see, do go over, have questions about. I guess we'll see. 6. Okay. 5 and 6 are going to be done similarly. Any others? For number 5, if you just have an x equals or a y equals, whatever that is, it's going to be either your x or your y intercept. So this is your x intercept. Now, off to the side, I'm going to draw a little graph. You can draw this if you so choose. If this is this equation, does this ever cross the y-axis? No. So then for your y-intercept, you can put none, and a doesn't exist. What we can't put is 0, because that would mean it goes through 0. So any of those, none, and a doesn't exist. So then it's the opposite for 6. The y-intercept is 0, 5. The x-intercept would be none, and a doesn't exist. Right. For 7, I'm sorry, for 8, same process as 1 and 2. Does not matter which one you solve for first. I just happen to solve for x first. Put 0 in for whichever one you're solving for first. So that x would equal what? -3. And we would write that -3, 0. And then for our y-intercept, do the same thing. Put 0 in for the other variable. So that we have -3y equals -21 and divide both sides by -3. That y equals -0.7 when you hit the ordered pair. but it should be +7 or so be careful with your negatives, double check your negatives. In number 10, you're gonna get a decimal for the x-intercept, and that's okay. When we put 0 in for y and put what's left, you can either leave it as -25/4, or what would that be as a decimal? What would 25 divided by 4 be it as a decimal? Come on, computer, you can put it as a decimal or a fraction, depending on if it's a nice decimal or not. Y-intercept do the same thing. Put 0 in for x. Solve for y. Okay, so when we are graphing, you need to follow these rules. Put the equation in y equals mx plus b format if it's not already. Plot the y-intercept, use the slope to create more points, and then connect the points into a line. So we're gonna do a few of these and then move on to something else. So for number 1, these are already in slope-intercept form, so we don't have to worry about that. What is the y-intercept here? 4, 3. Number is always a constant by itself, so we're going to put a point at 3. If you would like to outline the x and y axes so that they are bigger, thicker, and you don't get confused by the numbers, you can do that. And then if you also want to label them, right off to the side of each thing is, you can also do that if you don't have to. What is our slope here? -1. And we can really say it's -1/1. So if it is a negative, what directions could I go to get a negative direction? Down and so down and left are both negatives, and that would make a positive. So down and right. Or we could do the opposite, up and left. You don't have to draw the arrows, but if it helps you do that. So from the y-intercept, we can go up 1 and to the left 1 as many times as possible. Fill up your graph. And then we can do the opposite, go back to the y-intercept and go down 1 to the right 1 as many times as possible and fill up your graph. Then once you have all of your points, you can draw a line through all of them, connect the dots, make sure you have arrows at the ends. Questions on how we graph that? Going on to the next one. What is the y-intercept of number 2? -4, so we're gonna plot a point at -4. The slope is what? 3/1. It's positive. What directions could I go to get a positive slope? Up and right, or down and left. Now, in this case, I can't go down and left because I don't have any graph space, but if I could, I would. So we're just gonna go up and right, up 3/1 as many times as possible to fill up your graph. Connect your points and go on. Number 3, the y-intercept is 2. So +2, put a point there on the y-axis. And then your slope is already a fraction, so we don't need to put it over 1. It's positive again, so we can go up and to the right or down and to the left. So we're going to go both directions. Up 2 to the right 5, and down 2 to the left 5. Connect your points and make a line. And then we're going to do one more. Again, number 4 is already a fraction with the y-intercept. 1, +1, so put a point at +1 on the y-axis. Your slope is already a negative, so we can go up and left or down and right. So up 3 to the left 4, down 3 to the right. Connect your points, make the line. Once you have that written down and graphed, look at numbers 5 through 9. Find any others you want to see, do, go over, have questions about. Number 9. What is the y-intercept for number 9? It is 0. There's nothing there, so you have to either assume or know that it's 0. So put a point at the origin or in the middle. Slope is positive, 4/1. You can go up and right or down and left. So up 4 to the right 1, down 4 to the left 1. Now we're going to try some other ones. So now these are not in slope-intercept form. So not doing what we were just doing with intercepts, but think back to when we were dealing with our slope and had to convert it. You have to get this back into slope-intercept form. How could we do that? How could we get y by itself? Subtract x on both sides, so that we have 2y equals -x plus 4. And then divide everything by 2. So what would that new equation become? Not -2x because we're dividing Got the number in front of x, put over 2. Negative 1's half. So now we have our equation, now we can graph it. So start at your y-intercept, positive 2. Your slope is negative. So we can go down and right or up and left. Up 1, left 2 as many times as possible. Down 1, right 2 as many times as possible. Connect your points to negative 1. This 4, this 4. No. Let's do 11. Same process. Subtract your x. Subtract your 3x. So we have negative 2y equals negative 3x minus 6. Divide everything by negative 2. Be careful with the negatives. What would your new equation become? 3 over 2x plus 3. For points at positive 3, your slope is positive, so go up and right or down and left. Can't really go up because we don't have graph space, so down 3, left 2 as many times as possible. Connect your points to make it. Once you have that written in graph, go on to the next page. Find any 12 through 21 that we want to see, do go over and have questions about. For 16, if we are solving this for y, get rid of x by subtracting. And then when we divide everything by 3, what would the new equation become? Negative 1/3 x minus 1. So put a point at negative 1. The slope is negative, so we can go up and left or down and right. Up 1, left 3, down 1, right 3. Connect your points, make your one. Any others before I let you try a couple? $21. For 21, we are going to get rid of the 3x. And you can either keep this as negative 3x or add the 0, does not matter. So your y-intercept is going to be 0. Your slope is negative. So we can go up 3 to the left one, down 3 to the right one. Questions on that? I want you guys to try numbers 19 and 20. I'll give you 5 or so minutes to do that. Raise your hand when you have finished those two, and then we'll go back over them. If you have questions, let me know. If you didn't finish or didn't get a chance to check it, it's okay. Double check yours with the line up here. So your two lines should look something like that. You should be plotting all of your slope points, as many as possible, making sure you have arrows at the end. Both of your slopes should have been positive, so facing this direction, but both of your y-intercepts were negative. Questions on either of those? We're going to do this last page and then be done for today. So go to the next page. And I'm going to rewrite our koi bucks at the top and its definitions. So for our definitions, horizontal lines have 0 slope and are y equal. And then the opposite vertical lines have undefined slope and are x equals. So we talked about this when we did the slope, really to figure out what type of slope it had. But this will also help you with graphing when we move on to writing. It helped us with intercepts, a bunch of things. I didn't write this with the intercepts, but same. We really don't need the middle part, the slope. We just need the type of line and what it is. So for number 7, if this is a y equals, is it going to be a horizontal or a vertical line?
Horizontal.
Horizontal. So on your y-axis, I know the graph is not very nice. You're going to put a point at -5 on your y-axis. And then you're going to draw a horizontal line through that point, straight across. If this is an x equals, this is going to be horizontal or vertical? Vertical. So on your x-axis, put a point at -1 and draw a straight up and down line through that point. And then try number 9 and 10. Your two lines should look like these two. If they don't, fix them. So keep in mind your Hoy box, it will help you. And then we're going to answer some questions based on slope, the graphs, all those things. So what is the slope of the line y equals 5? Got your Hoy box. This is a y equals, should be 0. What is the slope of the line x equals -2? Are undefined. This last one's a trick question. What's the slope of the line x equals 0? Are still undefined. The 0 is in there to trick you. So then we're gonna draw or graph y equals 3 and y equals 3x and talk about some differences. So go ahead and draw those two or graph those two. And once you have the two graphed, what differences do you see? Okay. This one is in mx plus b slope-intercept form. This one is not really because it doesn't have an x. What else? Do these two graphs look the same? So what's different about them? All right. Okay. This is just a straight horizontal line, while this one's a straight diagonal. It's a diagonal line. Anything else? Not that it only has one point, it has many. We just don't draw them all. That would be a lot. I could draw every point. Or not that it doesn't have a slope, but the slope is 0. Slope has this one has a 0 slope, this one has a actual numerical slope of 3. What about intercepts? Do they both have 2 intercepts? No. This one does. Anything with an x and a y will always have 2 intercepts, but anything with just a variable, one variable, will only have one and not the other. So those are differences you need to keep in mind when you have to graph them both. That way you don't get confused. Okay. So that is the last piece of note thing we're doing today. I'm going to give you 3 options and you can choose which one. You can either work on Delta Math. You have many due on Friday if you haven't been doing them at all. Slopes, part 1 and part 2, x and y intercepts, graphing, linear equations. You'll have one more thing on linear transformations, but that we'll talk about next class. You can keep working through these notes. So go back through any questions we didn't do on the first and second pages. Slash at the back questions that look like the questions we've done. Or if you would like to do this graphing lines and killing zombies activity, you can come grab that. You have to grab both pieces. So you can work together, you can use your notes, your calculator, does notes, you can do any of those three, but be working on one of those. Use this time wisely. Let me know if you have any questions.